We're back again for our study here in the book of Mark, and we are continuing on with chapter 2. Mark chapter 2, the first little part there, we had focused on the man who was sick of the palsy and whatever all that was, some sort of paralysis, most likely, maybe quadriplegic or paraplegic. But anyway, whatever his need was, the 4 friends or family members, whoever it was, brought him to Jesus, lowered him through the roof. Jesus forgave his sins, but he also proved that power through also then raising him up to walk. And he did so. It just went out and they responded. Verse 12, we never saw it on this fashion. And so you have that there in the first part. Now we jumped up to verse 13, and it's another story. Not a parable, but an account, a narrative here on what was going on. Jesus had just left Capernaum, apparently, and in doing so, he was just passing along. Probably a number of people crowded around him. Don't know all the details there, but they usually were. And in verse 14, it says, and as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the receipt of custom, and said unto him, follow me. And he arose and followed him. Now, let's just touch on a few aspects there. That's probably as far as we're going to go today. Just wanted to touch on a few things here with this particular story. And the issue here is, obviously, Jesus has already called Peter and Andrew from their fishing, and then James and John also from their dad, but from the fishing boat. And so you have those 4 total, and this is the 5th one that we actually have record of, and this man's name is Levi. If you don't recognize that name as fitting quite in with the list of disciples, it may be because we're used to him from another name, and that name is Matthew, the very man who wrote the previous book. And actually, have a marker here. We find almost the very same story in Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, and he says, and he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the receipt of custom. It's the very same man. Matthew's telling his own story, and they sort of back one another up with that. Obviously, Matthew could tell better than anybody else what happened to him. But here in Mark, we also see the story, but he's called Levi here. He was sitting at the receipt of custom, and that's really where I want to sort of draw our attention today. The receipt of custom was sort of the tax center. This is where you have to come to pay taxes. These men who were responsible for that are called publicans in the Gospels. And so they are often associated with sinners. Many times you'll find it seems, they want to lump those two together. Publicans and sinners. Publicans and sinners. That's just the way it is. They were known as cheats. They were dishonest in their dealings. And so they had even gained wealth through overcharging in the assessment for these people. And so you have that dishonesty that was a part of the reason why they were looked down on so much. Besides that, though Matthew very likely was a Jew, he was representing Rome. And so when you start looking at it from that perspective, the Jews are wanting to get rid of the Roman rule. They don't like how Rome's thumb is on their society so much, their culture, and even their finances. And so they don't want to have to pay taxes. And of course, nobody does, I guess, even in this day, or very few would feel very, very kindly along that line. And so the same thing is happening here. And so they just look down on these publicans, these tax collectors. And of course, we have it here, but you also read the story in Zacchaeus, which I referred to earlier in this study. And you can look at his story and how Jesus said, I came especially for these ones. I wanted to seek and save the lost. And of course, we find a similar message in verse 17 as well. But notice that Jesus is stopping long enough. As he's passing by, you would think, if he's going to follow the normal pattern, he's just going to pass by a man like Levi. But though he was passing by in a general sense, he wasn't going to pass by in a spiritual sense. And he wanted to stop and and step in on Levi's livelihood, his daily work, whatever all was going on there. And so he stops, and he didn't just say, Levi, you can live better than this. Or, Levi, I want to spend a little time with you. He said, follow me. That call is the same call used in the disciples. And that's what he was really calling him to. Not just, I want to forgive your sins, which was involved, but I want you to be one of my disciples. I want you to be one of the 12. Even though nobody else may count you worthy, nobody else may think that I ought to even spend time with you, I want you as my disciple. And so that was the one main thing that I want to call to your attention today, is that Jesus sees the ones that we might think are unworthy, and he says, you are worth something. And I do want to save you. I want you to be my disciple. Now, of course, in this day, we're not talking about the 12, of course, but I want you to be the disciple for me in 2020. I want you to make a difference right now. I want you to come and have your life transformed by my power and grace. And so you see that right here in verse 14. Jesus is saying, Levi, I want you. And of course, you could think about the old Uncle Sam poster, I want you. And in a sense, Jesus was saying that for a man who's so unlikely. Nobody else would have understood it. You can read a little bit further here. Jesus goes in and he meets with the publicans and sinners. There you have it. That little couplet there, the publicans and sinners. Very possibly these are some of Levi's friends. And I don't know if he coordinated this or not, but anyway, he was able to get together with some of Levi's associates, and many publicans and sinners, and they sat there. They were following him. It says in verse 15, there were many. But then you see, even as sometimes happens in our day, you see that there are a few here that don't much like it. The scribes and Pharisees, the religious ones, the ones who thought they had it all put together, and they say, what are you doing with sinners? What are you doing with these publicans? And of course, Jesus had enough trouble as it was with these scribes and Pharisees, and now he's even called one of those, the down and outer, as the Pharisees would have looked at it, the ones who don't deserve any attention. He called one of them to be his disciple. And so we find right there in that passage a reminder of how Jesus counts the unworthy to be worthy of his attention, and reminded me of the song that it just goes by one word title, Unworthy. And in the chorus it says something like this, a beggar, I'm talking about me, a beggar in bondage and alone, but he made me worthy. And now by his grace, his mercy has made me one of his own, or something like that. And what a wonderful thing that Jesus counts us worthy. And so twofold aspect for our study today, just a few verses here. What is about 5 or 6 verses maybe. And just these few verses, just a reminder, I want you this week to think about 2 things. Number 1, how Jesus counted you worthy and counted me worthy. We don't deserve anything, and yet he saw us as worthy. And then the second thing is, think about that person that maybe you think doesn't deserve much attention, or maybe that in our minds we would say, they've ruined too many chances. And let's just remember a man like Levi and say, Lord, would you call another one? Would you give another chance even to that person, whoever it may be for you? And God help us to rejoice in it for ourselves, but also to keep praying, keep trusting for the Levi's among us today. God bless you this week. Keep meditating on this truth as you go throughout the week, even till we meet again.